that a little later, involved a tremendous amount of suspicion of the capabilities of the U.S. citizen to exercise careful judgment or to take care of himself, much less his family. It was much like on Market Street. How are you going to increase the amount of traffic and the speed while trusting on the common sense and the goodwill of people to do what they're supposed to do? People might be more likely to do what they're supposed to do if there's clear sets of rules and regulations with penalties attached. But if you start assuming that, then you're assuming that the citizen is basically, well, let's say, an idiot who needs protection. And a person who is in need of protection cannot be a citizen in the classic sense of the term, as understood by 18th and 19th century Republicans. So there was a conundrum here. So the state can grow in order to protect the citizen from people who are taking advantage of the ignorance and incapabilities of the citizen, of the incompetence of the citizen. But if the citizen is truly incompetent, then he or she doesn't deserve to be a citizen. So this was a big problem for people to work through. And maybe we're still working through it in many ways. The opposite side of pure food and drug laws was the flourishing of food fads, special diets, and personalized holistic approaches to health, which at least in their initial phases had absolutely no basis in anything scientific, but were based on kind of speculative ideas about how things held together. There was a film that was out in the 90s, which maybe some of you have seen, in which the main characters go to Kellogg's, the Kellogg Food Company. Kellogg cereal company was started as a health food company, and they had the craze of mastication, so you could not swallow until you had chewed every bite 100 times, which would slow down the process immensely. So let me and here is in the same book something that I'm going to put this online so you can look at it. Here's again a sample breakfast and dinner menus with the ability to calculate the cost, but then you have to figure out what that cost means in contemporary dollars, and a couple of menus. And here's an advertisement for food sausages, meat sausages, at the time that the Pure Food and Drug Act was passed. Breakfast menus. And here's a menu from a restaurant in 1892 in San Jose, I believe. You can take a look at this. Pardon? Yes, those are swastikas. Swastikas didn't have any evil connotations at this time. Yeah. And here is a menu for a Chinese restaurant in Sacramento, I believe, from 1922. Yeah, Sacramento, K Street. So you have the American bill of fare and Chinese bill of fare. So you can take a look at that. And strangely enough, what I don't quite understand, but the menu clearly has a wine and beer list. In 1922 is 2 years into Prohibition. So that's a puzzle. This is California. Anyway, ethnic food was generally something that develops at the beginning of the 20th century. It's unclear actually, but there were lots of Chinese restaurants in California throughout the 19th century. But whoever's looked at the menus would indicate only typical American food. And it's also not clear how the Chinese vegetables that are used in Chinese cooking would have been grown, since there's no record of any farmers growing such vegetables. But then in the 1910s, you start to get records of these vegetables. So is that because you need a larger state apparatus to be able to figure out what people are actually growing? Or was it because people weren't growing it because there wasn't a demand and people didn't eat fresh fruits and vegetables in this country anyway, until much later? So the point I want to come back to now is this issue of food and drug and milk legislation marking the growth of a federal regulatory state. Predictability was the goal and what made it politically feasible. The federal regulatory state allowed producers to say that their products are what they said they were, and customers could have some confidence. The other major area for growth of a federal regulatory state in this period, the Teddy Roosevelt and Taft administrations, was what was called at the time conservation, what we would call environmentalism. That is, the setting aside of land in various categories for protection from rampant exploitation, and the setting up of a rather, in this case, two sizable bureaucracies to determine what's on given parcels of land, what would be the most economical way of exploiting those resources, what needed to be set aside for long-term purposes, what needed to be set aside forever. So food and drug and then natural resources, conservation of resources, were the two big areas where the federal state could expand rapidly. The protection of public lands from market forces was in some ways equivalent to the protection of consumer bodies from rogue market forces was in the food and drug laws. So the Departments of Agriculture, the Department of Interior, became these two important sources, in the Department of Commerce for growth. It was successful because many corporations supported government action in these areas because it provided greater stability to how they would operate. Large corporations, in particular, were not opposed, and probably are not today opposed, to the heavy hand of the government affecting market processes, because the government provides a structure within which they can operate. But at this time we're talking about, these efforts were still fairly limited. It was still a nascent process. In 1930, the federal government was responsible for approximately 10% of all government expenditures in the United States. 10%. State governments were responsible for 25% of all government expenditures, and local governments, city and county governments, were responsible for the rest, which I think is 65%. I think today, in today's economy, the federal government is responsible for about 70% of total government expenditures. That's a big change. The change actually occurs by the end of the period that this class covers, and in the second part of the term, we'll get to how things move from 10% to 70%. Federal expenditures moved from 10% to 70%. It is important, I think, to note that growth did not occur in the military or the colonial apparatus. After the conclusion of the Philippines War, military personnel shrunk back to less than 50,000 people. Investments continued in the Navy, which was primarily a question of developing ships with the latest technology. It was a form of support for industry, but from the government's point of view, not something that was labor intensive. The Navy did not need to have a lot of men in uniform, as opposed to the Army. The Army was going to remain very small. On an absolute basis and on a per capita basis, the United States, of any industrialized country, had absolutely the smallest army in the world. And it would have the smallest army of the world until World War II. There was obviously a rapid growth of the army during World War I, but the post-war response to World War I was again disillusionment, not wanting to hear about it anymore, and a real determination amongst the political leaders and the populace that the military be shrunk. In the 1930s, even as Nazi Germany and Japan are arming and invading Spain and China, Congress continues to shrink the U.S. military. The United States was, by that time, the most powerful country in the world economically, but it had an armed force that was incomparable to its economic might, probably a factor in Pearl Harbor, but we'll get to that later. So the United States, in large part, remained an anti-militarist, pacifist country. Did not mean that it was incapable. I mean, it could go into places like Nicaragua and Haiti and occupy them and kill people and torture them, but that did not require a whole lot of boots on the ground. And in general, did not always lead to success. In Nicaragua in 1927, when the United States intervened in a civil war there, the Marines were unable to suppress the side that they thought was causing the problem. The armies led by Augusto Cesar Sandino. He could not win because of their presence, but the U.S. Marines in Nicaragua simply could not defeat him, which seems actually kind of absurd. Nor did Congress approve requested increases for immigration and border controls, despite consistent requests and